Hi, thanks for having me. Like Garrett said, I'm Fiona Burlig. I'm a PhD candidate in the Ag and Resource Department here at Berkeley. Ag and Resource Econ Department here at Berkeley. This is joint work with two other grad students in the same department, Matt Warman and Louis Priones. And I want to also say briefly thank you to BITS for funding this research. So we were SMART grant recipients from last year. And so this is a cool chance to share sort of what this project has turned into in the past year. All right. So the motivation behind this research is that there is an increasing number of randomized controlled trials being conducted in economics. And in particular, these randomized controlled trials are sort of increasingly ending up in top journals, right? So the number of RCTs that have ended up in top econ journals over the last, this figure is actually kind of old now, but over the last sort of 2 decades or so is sort of increasingly, is rising over time. And at the same time, sort of as we start to do more and more of these experiments, we need to think very carefully about experimental design, right? So if you're not Ted, if you're someone who's new to the field of randomized controlled trials, and you decide, hey, there's this really cool tool out here for doing causal inference, you need to sort of think about, well, how do I design a study that, or design an experiment that's going to sort of give me an answer that's useful for me and useful for the scientific community. So to that end, a useful randomized controlled trial, right, is going to be something that can fail to reject true null hypotheses and is going to reject false null hypotheses. Like that's an important sort of test of whether the experiment is doing something useful. And in order to make this happen, we need to have a sample that's sort of big enough that we can actually statistically detect effects and distinguish those effects from our null hypothesis. Okay. But how big is a big enough experiment? If sort of we lived in magical wonderland where we could have an infinite number of subjects in our experiments, that would all be sort of great on the one hand. You would never have to worry about not being powered. On the other hand, that's probably not the best use of the marginal research dollar, right? And so we sort of would like to allocate money among experiments such that experiments are able to detect effects that we think are sort of reasonably sized, but at the same time that we're not sort of pouring resources necessarily into one experiment when another experiment might actually also be a useful way of spending that money. Okay.
It's also
yeah.
ethical to use up more time, other people's time.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And so if the experiment is too big, it's going to be very expensive, and as you say, sort of using more subjects than you need to is maybe questionable. At the same time, if the experiment's too small, it might be hard to learn something that we need to learn, and sort of from a privately optimal standpoint, it might be hard to publish an underpowered experiment, right? And so how do we design an experiment to actually end up in this sweet spot, this Goldilocks spot where it's sort of enough people but not too many? Well, we use power calculations. So power calculations are a tool that have been developed sort of over the past 40, 50 years or so by empirical researchers to try and figure out how big of a sample size we actually need. Okay, so I'm going to try and keep this light on the math because it is 9 in the morning, but a couple of things just to fix ideas here. What we're thinking about is a minimum detectable effect size. So this is going to be the smallest effect that your experiment can statistically distinguish from your null hypothesis. Generally, we're going to be thinking about that null as being 0, but it doesn't have to be. And that's going to be a function of your type 1 error rate, alpha. So normally in econ at least, we think about 0.05. It's going to be a function of your type 2 error rate, 1 minus kappa. Again, the convention in economics is to set kappa at 0.8. That's pretty arbitrary. I would love to have conversations with people afterwards about sort of why we set kappa what we do, but this is sort of what's been accepted so far. And then, of course, the variance of the treatment effect estimator that you're using, right? And so what we're going to be thinking really hard about in this project is what is the variance of that treatment effect estimator under different scenarios. Okay, so I'm going to be sort of a typical economist and only cite other economists. I apologize for that in advance. Right now, the existing work in economics didn't fit on my title, so caveat there. Focuses on cross-sectional designs, right? So designs where we observe each subject one time. We're not sort of following them in a panel. Now, sort of the older, more descriptive work gives a sort of very basic outline of how these experiments work. One-shot RCT, randomized into treatment and control. We're done. There's been some sort of cool recent innovation. So this Baird paper looks at sort of thinking about cluster randomized designs, right? So if I'm interested in teasing out general equilibrium effects, for example, randomizing sort of more people in one village into treatment and less in another place, so we can actually think about spillover effects. That's some really cool work. And then sort of Athey and Imbens have this nice overview of sort of recent empirical methods in economics. I do want to highlight that there's also a large biostatistics literature that treats power calculations. We've looked through that. We haven't found anything that's doing exactly what we're doing, excuse me. If you know otherwise, please let us know. We'd love to cite them. But sort of in general, the majority of the work in economics, at least, has been sort of largely focused on these cross-sectional designs. That also makes a lot of sense in the econ context because a lot of what's happened so far has been experiments in development or in sort of other settings where collecting data can be expensive. And so we do a lot of these one-shot experiments. At the same time, there's sort of been limited work bringing these experimental or these power calculation tools into the panel data context. We think this is important. So I'm a development person, but I'm also an energy person. I live in a world where the last regression I ran had 80 million observations in it. And so I'm also living in a world where I can start to do experiments on some of those 80 million observations, right? We partner with utilities where we observe electricity consumption data every 15 minutes for your household. And so that is a ton of data. And obviously has new sort of openings for questions, but also new sort of statistical challenges that are going to be different from what you would face in the one-shot experiment. Now, I want to highlight that this isn't only sort of something for people in energy land. There are sort of decreasing costs over time to collecting panel data, right? So we're seeing more and more people doing development experiments with cell phones and sort of mobile data collection, these kinds of things. So the cost of collecting multiple waves of data on a subject over time are also declining. And so I think there's a cool opportunity to start using panel data and sort of moving into this multi-wave future. But as we do that, like I said, we need to start adjusting the way that we do our power calculations. So to that end, there's a really nice paper by Mackenzie who sort of summarizes and brings into econ notation older work in biostats by Frisson and Pocock that's going to be thinking about randomized controlled trials in a panel data context. And so, like I said earlier, we have this minimum detectable effect size, which is going to hinge on the variance of our estimator. In the Frisson and Pocock world, where you assume a very limited type of serial correlation, which I'm going to show you a picture of in just a second, this is what the variance of that estimator looks like. So P here is the proportion of units that are randomized into treatment. J is the total number of units in your study. M is the number of pre-treatment observations you have for each unit. R is going to be the number of post-treatment observations you have for each unit. And then the sigma squared omega is going to be the residual variance of your estimator. Okay, so these papers accommodate only very limited types of serial correlation. And in particular, they allow for this kind of serial correlation. So essentially, if you're sort of in my world, you think about this as once I've put in an individual specific fixed effect, then I've taken care of all of the serial correlation. That's the only type of serial correlation that this panel or this power calculation formula is going to be able to handle. Importantly, it can't handle something like this, which is sort of more typical of the types of serial correlation that we like to think is present in panel data. And in particular, if you know this paper, Bertrand, Duflo, Mullinaethan, that came out in the QJE, sort of hugely influential paper that says, look, if we're living in a panel data world and a difference in difference setup in particular, this type of serial correlation that is not just this level shift for an individual is present in all sorts of data sets, and we are going to get our inference wrong if we don't take care of that when we're thinking about our standard errors, right? And so if you're a researcher that's setting up a randomized controlled trial in a panel data setting, and you have used Frisson and Pocock, you should be a little nervous about this because Bertrand, Duflo, and Mullinaethan suggest that there are types of serial correlation that are likely to be present in your data, even once you've randomized, that sort of will throw off your statistical inference. So in particular, in a cross-sectional RCT, we normally think about like, oh, I've randomized, so now I don't need to cluster my observations by village or whatever it is, as long as I've randomized at the individual level. That's true, but once you start taking things into panel data land, now we want to worry about correlation within an individual over time, and so that's what we're sort of thinking about here. Okay. So what we can do then is to test how well do the assumptions of this model, sort of IID error assumption, work under sort of different data settings, and we're going to do it in a place where we can really heavily control the data that we're thinking about, so we're going to make up some data ourselves. So the idea here is we're going to generate data that includes a serially correlated error. We're going to do an AR1 just because it's an easy thing to think about. And so what we're going to then do is take our data set. Using the parameters that went into designing that data set, we're going to figure out what the minimum detectable effect should be according to the formula that I just showed you. And then we're also going to do a placebo one where we set a treatment effect size of 0. What we're going to then do is sort of take our fake data and apply a treatment effect size that sort of this Frisman-Pocock-McKenzie formula says we should apply, says our experiment should be able to detect at the right level of power. And then we're going to simulate that through with 10,000 experiments and see what happens. Okay, so here's what happens. Oh, no, sorry, one more thing. So what is this going to produce? This is going to produce a realized power, so a % of the draws that reject the null, and then also a realized false rejection rate, which is going to be a % of the draws that reject the null when we've treated them with a treatment effect size of 0. Okay, and we're going to stick with the convention here and target an 80% realized power and a 5% false rejection rate. Okay, so this is what happens when we do that. All right, these experiments, if everything, if the assumptions were all satisfied of this model, everything would be lying on that 80% line. And you see that in the world where our AR1 dependence parameter is 0, that's in fact what happens, right? We get exactly 80% power for all of these panel lengths. But as we start to increase the level of serial correlation that's present in our data, we start to end up with overpowered experiments on the short panel side and underpowered experiments on the long panel side. However, there's also a trick here that I haven't showed you, which is that I didn't cluster my standard errors in these experiments. And so this is sort of the central result of Bertrand Duflo-Mullinayathon, which is that if you don't cluster your standard errors in the presence of serial correlation, you end up with these false rejection rates that are way, way, way too high, right? These, again, should all be sitting right at 0.05, which is what happens when, in the gray line where you have no serial correlation. But as we start to crank up that serial correlation parameter, then we can get false rejection rates of up to 60%, and that should be really worrisome. Okay, but we know how to deal with that, right? That paper came out in 2004. It's 2016. We figured this out by now. And so what we do is we're going to cluster our standard errors ex post. Now, when we start to do that, you should be thinking that there's sort of now a fundamental mismatch between what you did ex ante to design your power calculations and what you're doing ex post. Because ex post, you're now like, oh, there's serial correlation here. I need to do something about that. But ex ante, you're sort of ignoring it. And here's what happens if you do that. So same Frisman-Pocock experiment. Oh, sorry, this is the old version of these slides. The new version of that has the gray line up on the 0.8. We had a bad simulation draw. But the central point remains the same here, which is that now you see on the right that the false rejection rate has been controlled, right? We're on alpha is 0.05 for all of these levels of serial correlation. But now we're way more underpowered than we were before. And the sort of intuition behind that makes sense, which is that once you cluster your standard errors are going to get bigger. So you're going to have a harder time detecting small effects, basically, is what's happening here. Okay. So what we're going to do now is extend this formula. We have sort of a 80-page mathematical appendix that does all of this stuff, including working through how you do this with actual data and simulations. But the idea here is we're going to start with the same sort of chunk of formula, right? This is exactly the same beginning as we had before. But now we're going to start thinking about different types of correlation that enter into these, that show up in your variance covariance matrix, if you will. So the idea is that we're going to add 3 terms. One that captures the average covariance between 2 observations in the pre-treatment period. One that captures the average covariance between 2 observations in the post-treatment period, and one that captures that covariance across periods. Okay, you see that the pre-period and the post-period one enter positively. And so what that means is you're going to be increasing your variance. Remember that your minimum detectable effect is increasing in your variance. We want to think about small minimum detectable effects. So things that are positive here are bad for you. And then the cross-period one enters negatively. Why is that? So we're thinking here about difference-in-differences models. For the sort of pre and post average covariance, what you can kind of think about is the classic intuition of clustering, which is that if I see my own consumption over time a bunch of times, and that's super highly correlated, that's basically as though I had less data on myself, right? Instead of treating me as 100 observations that are each IID, I really should be thinking about that as like 30 real observations. But what's going on with the cross-period covariances is that this is a difference in differences model. So we're identifying off of changes. And so the sort of flatter the line is across the pre-treatment and post-treatment segments, the easier it is going to be to figure out what the jump is, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so we've added those three terms. And so depending on the relative size of these two things, or of these three things, the effect on the minimum detectable effect relative to a world with no serial correlation is going to be ambiguous. And what we can show is when we use our own formula on that same set of AR1 data that I showed you before, rather than having sort of this wildly overpowered and then underpowered segment, we actually get bang on 80% every single time. And again, we're still clustering our standard errors ex post, so we get our 5% false rejection rate. So the really cool thing here is that we've sort of taken this serial correlation into account analytically, managed to fix the problem, and now we can also do ex post inference in a way that's consistent with our ex ante assumptions. And so what we're excited about here is seeing more and more people write this into pre-analysis plans, seeing more and more people start to use these tools to think about doing power calculations in settings with panel data, because now we can actually make what we're doing when you get the data, come home, run your regression reg, comma, cluster, consistent with what you planned when you set up your experiment in the first place. Okay. So I showed you a bunch of stuff with fake data, but now I want to prove to you that this also works in real data. So what we've done in this paper is we've sort of added in 2 additional data sets that come from real world settings. This first one here comes from an RCT that Nick Bloom and co-authors ran in China and got published in the QJE. This was about workers' productivity when they work from home. And what we've done is we've taken, so this isn't the full sample from their experiment, but basically they had weekly observations on these call center workers' productivity. What we've done is we've taken only the pre-treatment period of that data and sort of run the same process through. Now you notice obviously there aren't like 7 lines on here because we didn't add in our own correlation. This is using the correlation structure in the data, and the important thing here is that unlike the AR1 where I sort of could have reverse engineered everything myself, here I have no idea what the underlying correlation structure is, so I had to actually estimate it to get the right answer. And you see again here this light blue dashed line is what the sort of traditional power calculation formulas produce, whereas the sort of navy dark line gets you power to 80% every time, right? So this is sort of number of pre and post periods on the x-axis. The thing that's worrying here, potentially at least, is that this actual experiment was run with sort of 40 periods, so that puts it just about there, potentially, right? And so when we think about power ex post, what does it mean to have, say, 50% power, right? That means that you flip a coin. That's perfectly, 50% coin, and there's essentially a 1 in 2 chance that your experiment that will recover on average the true treatment effect because it's randomized properly. There's a 50% chance that you won't be able to reject the null of no treatment effect, even if the actual beta hat is correct. Right, and so that should be worrisome. If you think about, you can sort of look at studies and sort of figure out how powered they were ex post by looking at the statistical significance of their results. Another Nick Bloom RCT was this intervention called Does Management Matter, where they went and spent millions of dollars. It's like literally one of the most expensive RCTs ever done. Millions of dollars in essentially pro bono consulting to Indian garment manufacturers. That thing is ex post powered at 50%, right? So the most expensive RCT that econ has produced in the past 5 years or so sort of had a 50% chance of having a star on that result. Now, we can talk a lot about whether having a star on that result is the thing that we should care about ultimately, but as a private researcher trying to publish in a top journal, like that's pretty important to me, right? And so the point here is just to say, essentially, that if you use the traditional methods, you have a high likelihood of being being dramatically underpowered in panel data settings in real data, but we can come in with our new analytics and actually correct that sort of even in the world where we don't actually know the underlying covariance structure. Okay, so you might say, well, I cherry-picked this experiment, like this is something that turned out to actually have an AR1 process or something underneath it, so I'm going to show you data from a totally different setting, which is American energy consumption. So this was not actually an experiment, but this is data from Pecan Street, which is sort of a data aggregator out of the University of Texas. And basically what they do is they get really, really detailed, so sort of 5-minute in the raw data and hourly in the data they make public electricity consumption data for a bunch of households in Texas. And there's also a bunch of other cool things that you can do with it. Go take a look if you're interested in energy. They actually track like your consumption for your water heater and your consumption for your light bulbs and all this other stuff. But what we're doing is just sort of using the sort of total energy consumption in the house. And what we do is we say, hey, we know that the data actually shows up hourly but we can collapse that data to different levels of aggregation to see if that's going to have a different effect on what the serial correlation structure ends up looking like, right? So we do this 4 different ways. We take the data, the raw data that's hourly, we collapse it to the daily level, we collapse it to the weekly level, we collapse it to the monthly level. And when we do this, we again show in sort of all of these cases that the Frisson and Pocock experiments are going to be either under or overpowered depending on the correlation structure and the length of the panel, whereas our serial correlation robust formula gets it right every time. The other thing that we've done here is we've imposed an AR1 process. The thought experiment here is like, okay, it's probably a lot of work to actually go through and estimate all of these underlying parameters, so these 3 additional parameters that I'm going to need for this serial correlation robust power calculation formula. I don't really know what those are. I don't really know how to estimate them. So what if I just assume an AR1 instead? And you can do that. And so in the case of the hourly data, that actually gets much closer to correct. But in the daily, weekly, and monthly data, you're still very off, right? So the idea here is that imposing some kind of assumed AR1 structure might get you slightly closer, but it's definitely not going to get you the right answer. And the degree to which that's close depends completely on the data set, the level of aggregation, these kinds of other things. And so there's no way of being very confident that your AR1 assumption is going to be correct here, right? So we do really think that it's important to actually non-parametrically take care of the serial correlation structure. As part of what we've done is in this like long appendix that I was referring to earlier, we have a long guide of like exactly detailed information on how to calculate these parameters using data. And then also we're going to release some software hopefully next week that does all of this stuff for you. So that's going to be useful as well. Okay, so this is kind of more like what you're used to seeing, which is I've sort of shown you in these simulated experiments what kind of level of power would I actually achieve. Now we can look at what a sort of power curve might look like. So this is plotting the minimum detectable effect size against the number of households required using this Pecan Street data. And on the left, you see for varying levels of panel length. Now, as you would expect, as you increase the panel length, you need fewer and fewer units per sort of for a given minimum detectable effect size. That makes sense. But at the same time, you notice that the Frisson and Pocock result is sort of shifted down and to the left relative to the serial correlation robust idea. So the point here is, again, that if you use Frisson and Pocock, you're going to think that you need fewer units for a given minimum detect size than you actually do, and you might be in store for a nasty surprise when you design your experiment thinking you've got everything powered appropriately, then you come home, you get your data, you run your regression with comma cluster, and all of a sudden you have no stars on anything, and you're like, what happened? Even if the minimum detectable effect size is exactly what you thought it would be ex ante. Okay. Or sorry, even if the actual treatment effect size is what you thought it would be ex ante. Okay, so then how do you actually do this? The easiest way to do it, and the sort of most foolproof way of doing this, is with simulation. So if you actually have a data set that is close to representative of what your experimental data are going to look like, the easiest way to do this is via simulation, and there's definitely people out there who are doing simulation-based power calculations already. Keep doing it. This is the right thing to do. The benefits of doing this are that it easily accommodates complicated designs, right? So in my model, I have sort of 2 sets of fixed effects. If you want to add some weird interaction or a different type of treatment or sort of heterogeneous treatment effects, that kind of thing. In the analytics, you have to then sit down for another 2 weeks and re-derive everything. In the simulation, you just have to simulate it and let your computer do the work for 2 weeks, right? Additionally, it avoids sort of these large headaches that are involved in estimating these psi parameters that turn out to be sort of not completely trivial. The good thing about this project is that we've worked through a lot of those headaches already for you, so now we have good tools as to how you can do that. The challenges with doing simulation are that it can be computationally and time intensive. It's also not always possible, right? So if you don't have a data set that's perfectly representative of what you're going to do, in particular, if your data set has too few units, there's things you can do to correct that, right? So you can bootstrap your units, and that can mostly get around that problem. But if you have a data set that has just a really short time series, it's going to be really hard to simulate something and get an accurate result. And so in that context, it's also going to be hard to do the analytics. Any power calculation is going to be hard. Even the Frisson and Pocock or just the one-shot RCT is going to be hard to adequately power if you have no information on what your sort of underlying data are. But the analytics can help provide a guide, and you can think about doing multiple sort of simulations of analytics where you vary the sensitivity to different parameters. we can also think about the analytic results as sort of guiding how big things should be relatively, right? So if you have a certain residual variance, then we think your across period correlation is going to be smaller than your within period correlation and that kind of thing. And if you have some idea of what some of these things are, thinking through the analytics carefully can help you sort of bound these effects. Okay, so just to finish up really quickly, in this paper what we've done is demonstrate that the existing approaches to power calculations for panel data are going to fail under serial correlation. We've then analytically derived a new formula that is going to achieve the desired power with arbitrary serial correlation. And then we've taken these methods to data from a development RCT in a high-frequency energy setting to show that the difference between existing methods and our method is going to be economically meaningful. And then finally, we're now in the process of putting together software that's going to be available in both Stata and R. Paper should be out online on the UC Berkeley Energy Institute website next week, along with appendix and software. So we would love to hear your comments. Please check out our code, send us debugging information, all that stuff. Thanks so much.
Time for a question? Adam, on your way up? Yeah.
Hey, thanks. So this is like more of a rhetorical question on these sort of things in general. But like you think about this as, you know, we have y equals f of x plus epsilon, and you're thinking about what's the distribution of e, or maybe joint distribution of xe. But like we never know the DGP, right? We never know the f of x part. And so all that's getting loaded onto the error term. It seems to me that thinking about this as model misspecification as opposed to just sort of serial correlation, it expands the value of it, rhetorically gives you like a broader set of things, and it sort of recognizes that we never really know anything about, you know, E or any of that, right? That we don't have to. So we don't have to think about a serial correlation, right? It's lots of kinds of model misspecification.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that actually fits really nicely into this framework and is a good way of sort of setting up what we're doing. So thanks for that. Yeah, I agree.
So that's a very interesting piece of work. Let me reveal my prejudice, and then you can correct my thinking on this, which is I'm a model-driven kind of guy. So I'm going to make sure that my model captures all the relevant things that I think are important for studying a data analysis, and then I'll do maximum likelihood, or I'll do, you know, if I feel the energy, I'll look at marginal likelihoods because I'm a Bayesian, and I feel that's all I need to do. So if there's a heteroscedasticity problem, or a correlation problem, I'm going to build that into my model and carry out the enterprise, which I think is suited to the data that I'm going to work with. I think you're kind of confirming my view, which is if you do these asymptotic corrections without building that explicitly into your model, first of all, you're not really correcting the estimates, which is the more important part, not the standard errors, because you're sticking with the original estimates. And secondly, you're really not getting standard errors that are suited to the estimate that you have. You're having these weirdly asymptotic standard errors. So I kind of feel the advice should be mine, which is you got to be explicit with regard to the parameters in your model and carry out the implications of the data analysis according to the model that you're committed to.
So yeah, I think that's, I think basically what you said is that you are smarter than I am at knowing sort of what should go into my model, right? So ex ante, I think basic part of what I'm saying is I don't have a good sense of what the data generating process actually looks like, which to your point. And so I want to try and be as agnostic as possible in some sense to then allow the data to tell me, but then I'm also going to be willing to acknowledge that I don't know, and so ex post then be willing to do some of these asymptotic corrections. Now you're right that sort of getting those right means you need to have enough units for your clustering to actually sort of end up in like asymptotic land. And I think there are definitely, and it's been shown sort of all over econometrics, that there are gains when you do know exactly what your data are going to look like or have some sense of what your data are going to look like. Building those kinds of things into the model can be important. But if you really don't know, then I think it's important to acknowledge that and sort of be agnostic in this way.
I have to respond because I think that you're promising too much. In a sense, when you get to asymptopia, then you're going to deliver on that promise. But before you get to there, you're not going to. The job of the statistician is to draw the borderline between the kinds of data that the method will work well for and the kinds of data that the method will not work well. And no method is going to work well under every circumstances. It really depends upon the closeness between the model structure that you use and what's actually generating the data. But I think if we promise some kind of asymptotic return, and we pretend and we kind of sweep all these problems under the rug, we're giving the community that we are communicating our results to, we're giving them false information.
I think that's fair as well. I guess what I'd like to sort of wrap up with, though, is that we're sort of, at this point, speaking to a world that is already thinking that it's living in these asymptotic assumptions, right? And so there's one approach, which is to say, hey, you guys are completely wrong about all of this, and we should be taking a different tack, and I think that's a valuable line of research as well. What we're saying is, hey, given the assumptions of your world, let's actually see if we can do some fixes to make this fit the sort of what you think you're doing better. Does that help? Okay, cool. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you.